Last speaker before Smoko, so I'll fly through it. I reckon it'll take 9 minutes to warm up and about 10 minutes to give this presentation. So I came across this lovely little quote recently, and it really struck a chord in me, because this is a picture of my office. I've spent the best part of 25 years working in beech forests in the South Island, trying to make rational decisions while surrounded by a sense of peace that only nature can bring, really, and which is as close to faith as I want to get. I also have worked for 25 years in an industry running purely on faith, because it's been hard work. And I think in our interactions with nature, whether it's solving the battle, winning the battle for the birds, or planting 300,000 hectares of indigenous forest, we're going to need the evangelical faith of Joan of Arc coupled with good, solid science and economic truths. So it's now more than a quarter of a century since the introduction of the Forest Act amendments, which gave us a solid, workable framework within which to address the challenge of balancing ecological sustainability with societal demand for wood products. So I want to offer a very broad overview of where I see our industry. And as a function of ageing, and for the purpose of checking my moral compass, I increasingly question what I do. And I'm fully aware that felling indigenous trees is an anathema to many people, so I choose to pose the question, is there a need for an indigenous timber industry? Oh, sorry, I'll get there. The basic premise that I've operated under is that wood is a sustainable resource and societies use wood, and we should endeavour to produce what we use responsibly. And there's no question it is the most sustainable, environmentally friendly building product we can use. You just have to do the calculations on concrete, steel or plastics to figure it out. So there's at least 3 billion cubic metres of wood fibre utilised from the world's forests annually. And while a significant and increasing volume comes from intensively managed plantations, a disproportionately high percentage still comes from natural forests. And in New Zealand, we made a decision, which was noted earlier, to separate land areas into productive use and conservation categories, and we love bright lines on maps. Agriculture and forestry are focused and intensified, and I think we're starting to kind of get a feel for some of the problems with that intensification, and the conservation estate is locked up. Yet our little industry operates exactly on that margin of separation. We're dealing with the natural world, attempting to utilise low levels of products while managing for multiple objectives. I want to go and see this in the morning too. This actually came from wind-thrown recovered Rimu on the west coast when 40,000 hectares of native forest blew down in 2014. We got specific legislation which is now finished. And perhaps a very welcome trend is the movement exemplified by this conference to build resilience and biodiversity into our productive managed landscapes. Conversely, we could accept that some natural forested ecosystems may produce timber as an arising of management for multiple non-timber objectives. So we use indigenous timbers mainly for high-end decorative uses. There's no commodity house building, anything like that. It's all the flash stuff. This was actually my old school, and this was a, if I told you this was plastic or extruded fiberglass, you would probably be shocked, but it's actually 600-year-old kahakatea that died in a farmer's paddock on the west coast, and I felled it and chainsaw milled a 9 by 1 metre slab out of it and gave it to my old school. And some gentleman turned it into that, which I think is just tells the story. And getting a haka by 1,200 boys was probably one of the highlights of my career too. The much vaunted parliamentary playground, of which about $25,000 was timber, and which makes me want to be a consultant. So we have a saying in business that our aim is to have a happy customer, and that a good customer is one who pays on time. but by far the best customer is one who comes back. So if any of you were there, thank you. We got the second order. Too soon. So I'll blow through it now, and I want to do our industry in 4 slides. With any contentious resource issues, it's good to understand the scale of the problem. So we have about 6.4 million hectares of indigenous forestry, or forest. A lot of it's deep land protection. And around 80,000 hectares is legally registered under some form of sustainable management plan or permit. So we're impacting on significantly less than 1% of our indigenous forest. And when I say impacting, we're not talking about clear felling forests or changing land uses here, but a highly prescribed and regulated form of continuous cover near natural forest management. So the whole regulatory environment is about protecting the forest structure and the composition and its ability to sustain itself into the future. And from that highly scattered and fragmented resource, we have an allowable harvest of about 83,000 cubic metres of standing tree volume a year. And the industry is currently milling about 18,000. So this could indicate a total lack of demand for wood, or it could indicate that we're fighting against a lot of issues to sustain a niche within the demand. Now, this graph shows indigenous timber in orange against imported timbers in grey. And I've deliberately gone to 1993 because that's when the Forest Amendment came in. And through the period into the early 2000s was when the Crown, through Timberland's West Coast, their SOE, exited management of forests. And then they left it up to, this is the development of the indigenous industry on privately owned land only. And we see other points of interest, I guess, are the global financial crisis and the COVID pandemic, which are great at moderating our consumption, obviously. So today we're bringing in about $100 million worth of imported timbers, and we're producing about, oh, this is cubic metres, I'll talk cubes. We're bringing in about 70,000, 80,000 and producing about 8. So at the end of the day, we're running at about 4% of our consumption, I think, is produced in New Zealand. This graph also neglects about $550 million worth of wooden furniture that's manufactured and shipped here. We used to have significant furniture industry in small towns, which all died out through this period. So that 550 million, if you take off the value multipliers, probably comes back to about 20,000 cube. So I think we're using about 110,000 cubic metres of somebody's indigenous forestry a year, of someone's indigenous products. It's just consumption in society. I guess another message is that stopping timber production has arguably not stopped consumption. And from an emissions accounting standpoint, it's possibly made the world a worse place. There's stuff coming in here from Russia, California, Indonesia. So in terms of the specialty timber market, and I'm just talking about decorative timber if we haven't figured it out, I'm not talking about exotics. Our industry's worth about $25 million in sawn timber today. And I'm saying there's about 10 million of special farm-grown acacia, blackwood, eucalypts. I don't really know. I made that number up because I've got no idea where to find it out. But I'll tell you what, it's not much, and it doesn't change the trend here. We've got 100 million of imports at wharf, and that's at wharf price. That's not the retail price, that's across the wharf. So you can double that by the time it gets to the shop. We've got a whole chunk of solid furniture. So we use nearly $700 million of someone else's indigenous timber just to keep our society happy. And around 4% of our demand is produced here. So there's a lot of headroom, Paul Quinlan, there's a lot of headroom for growth and for import substitution if you choose to get into this. So look, consumption and the acquisition of more stuff is the big issue here. Systems that strive to achieve sustainability are needed on both sides of the natural and the managed world. Ultimately, I feel our consumption exceeds and undoes any conservation gains we may have made. The importation of clear-felled Siberian larch from the taiga forests, shipped to the furthest point of the globe and deemed acceptable to clad our houses, does not make sense, but it's kind of a logical environment that we've operated in for the best part of 25 years. I like to just reflect that as difficult as it is, we have an extremely strong and back.
The little red one.
Oh, come on. We have an extremely strong democracy, one of the longest, strongest democracies. We have one of the highest indexes for, this is the one bit I took off my notes, I'm sorry, I've got to get this right. We're one of the top 3 countries on the corruption index, and you can take that how you want it, but what it means is we're right near the top for low levels of corruption. So we've got very sound regulatory frameworks. 29 years of the Forest Act, which I sarcastically note is achieving its goal of creating or allowing a niche industry to exist. We've got actionable enforcement and prosecution. We've had 2 court cases a year for 30 years, basically, for people breaking the laws. So it's very important to note that because the system works in regulating what we do. And lastly, I just note that locally produced products offer the lowest possible emissions profile. You may get the opinion that I am in favour of producing timbers locally and having homegrown industries with artisans in small towns creating furniture that lasts 3 generations instead of just importing rubber wood and stuff. I just want to finish, and this will be the biggest challenge of the night if I can read this, but the 9th IPCC report stated, in the long term, a sustainable forest management strategy aimed at maintaining or increasing forest carbon stocks while producing an annual yield of timber, fibre or energy from the forest will generate the largest sustained mitigation benefit. Now, I look around for Kit Richards, who's not here, and I say to him, we were there 20 years ago. And I'm just going to finish on this slide because I said it was my office, but for those that didn't pick it, this is actually a harvest site where we've removed timber from an old growth natural forest. And it's worth 1 minute of your time because this was helicopter logged. You can see in the centre a large senescent habitat tree with cavities for birds left on site. You can see in the foreground the head section of a tree that's been extracted and all the waste and biomass left in the forest to fulfil ecosystem services. You can see there's no ground disturbance, no machinery. You can see the regrowth just springing away and filling the hole. And this is how I've worked for 20 years. So I'm very, very proud of that. And I'm going to leave it there. But I will take one question because you have to earn your money. Anyone game?
Yeah, we got one here, but just so you know, usually I'm the comic relief, but you were actually quite funny.
Oh, thanks.
Where are those imported timbers coming from, and what are the main products they're used for?
Okay, well, a lot of them are okay by me. A big chunk of it is Canadian and North American species, and they have pretty good forest management. But once again, it comes down to accepting that cedar comes in here in huge volumes, but it's clear-felled, massive clear-fells. They're still doing it that way. But it's okay because it works for them. There's a lot of stuff from Indonesia, about probably the equivalent of what we produce comes in from Indonesia and the Solomons. There's purple heart from Suriname, which is used on all the cross members in all our power poles. There's stuff literally from 50 or 60 countries coming in here that we don't really know. I've been to warehouses where there's 12 different types of Amazonian hardwood for sale. So it's there, you just got to look for it. Largely, though, I think the imported timber is under control and they do a great job. My whole point about this is that as humans living in these societies, we consume a lot of wood. We need to be responsible for where it comes from. Okay, thank you.